So today, I want to remind everybody that if you come to Laketon Bethel, you're not going to hear a sermon, because I don't do traditional sermons. I watch them online every once in a while, and they just irritate me. So what we're doing more is, what I'm trying to do here is more of an illustrated Bible study. And I hope that that's okay with everybody, but I'm sure it's not with everybody, but I hope so. You'll get used to it. So my goal is to turn everybody into a Bible scholar. You know, old men need goals too, and that's my number one goal, is to make sure that everybody who comes here has an opportunity to learn something new, because the more you know about the Bible, the more understandable it is. The more understandable the Bible is, the more understandable your faith will be. Facts are a friend of faith, and we need to embrace those. You know, the more you know about the Bible, the more you learn, the more solid your faith is. And so that's why I do things the way I do. Now the illustration part, you know, years ago I was heavily involved in Reese Puffer soccer. 3 of my daughters were into it, and you know, they even were one of them was on a travel team for a while, which travel teams are miserable. But, you know, they have to be done every once in a while. So, you know, I deserted. I played soccer myself. For 2 years in college, I was actually on the soccer team, and I coached here for 7 years. And then my daughters went and played for Reese Puffer. Our daughter Jenny actually got a scholarship for soccer at Trinity International University in Chicago, which is now closed. They took a bad dive with the whole COVID thing. But, you know, my experience with that is these are really nice girls, you know, and I enjoyed hanging out with them. Sometimes I would transport more than one of them. In the early days, I had a Ford Club wagon. You can fit a whole soccer team in that thing. But, you know, in the early springtime, or late spring rather, you know, and the weather starts to warm up, and all these little girls start sweating. Then they come in your van, and they take their shoes off, and they take those shin guards off. And you are actually gasping for oxygen at that point. Especially in the warm weather. It's just a nasty aroma. And I remember one day it was probably 75, 80 degrees, and I went, I had, I think 3 or 4 soccer girls with me, and I stopped at Wesco, because, you know, they know that I'll buy them treats, so they want to go to Wesco. I did that. I locked the van up and went inside, and it took a little longer than normal. You know, soccer girls are different than soccer boys. I don't want to sound sexist here, but they all have flip-flops in their backpacks. So they peel those shoes off, put the flip-flops on, and go into Wesco. And, you know, they were horsing around. I think there's about 8th grade or something like that. But you know how Wesco has these slushy machines, and they can't just get one flavor. You know, they have to layer that thing about 8 different, whatever, however many kinds. So it took a while. Got back out to the van, and I unlocked it, and oh man. Now, I grew up on wading through hog manure. This is way worse, okay? My van smelled like a locker room with a litter box in it. And there was some kind of a sour smell too, like vinegar or something. So I wanted to do that to set you up for the passage that we have today. The scientific term for stinky feet is bromodosis. And a certain nurse that I'm well acquainted with told me it's easily treated with antibacterial soap. Now, see what you learn if you come to church? I mean, where else are you going to get that kind of important, pertinent information? All right, well, nasty foot smell is encountered by everyone from time to time. It's just a part of life. I don't know if you've ever washed the feet of someone with nasty smells. I don't think I've ever washed anyone's feet. But, you know, it does happen. My dad used to, when he got older, he would get a pedicure every time he got a haircut, because he couldn't reach his toes anymore. You know, he developed a little bit of a girth situation and lost some of his flexibility. I always tell people my weight loss goal is to be able to take care of my toes and breathe at the same time. But he would go in and get this pedicure, and they would soak his feet while they were cutting his hair, and then they would do that. Now, I can promise you that I'm probably the least likely person in this building to ever get a pedicure. But my dad used to get them, and, he was into it. Did you ever think about having to wash somebody else's feet? It's kind of a strange thing to think about. But our daughter Jamie did home health care while she was going to Grand Valley, and she kept one of her clients and still goes there. She still takes care of his feet, and she's offered to give me a pedicure, and I said, "You are not touching my feet." Some things are sacred, and that's just it. But I brought this up because foot washing was very common in Jesus' day. It's like at the Iowa State Fair, they tell you, there's signs up all over the place, please keep your livestock off the sidewalks, because livestock do their thing wherever they feel like it. And the people of Jesus' day wore sandals, which were just a strip of leather tied to their feet with other strips of leather. And if you'd go to a banquet, the slave's job was to wash your feet. Now, if you were going to a banquet or a special meal, it was considered normal etiquette to take a bath first. So they did that. And of course, they didn't have running water in those places, so they'd have to go down to the river or wherever and take a bath. The Romans hadn't installed their fancy baths in Jerusalem at that time. So you took a bath and then you came to the meal. It was especially important that if you were a Jew and you had to take a bath for the Seder, which is the Passover meal. Takes place on what we call Maundy Thursday. It's just before Easter, and Easter coincides with the Passover when Jesus was crucified. The Seder, the Passover meal, was the most holy meal in the Jewish religion in those days. And when you arrived, it was customary for a slave to wash your feet. And that was the setting for today's passage. Jesus in Jerusalem just hours before his crucifixion, and this is taken from John chapter 13. So just before the Passover feast, Jesus knew that the time had come to leave this world to go to the Father. Having loved his dear companions, he continued to love them right to the end. It was supper time. The devil by now had Judas, son of Simon the Iscariot, firmly in his grip, all set for the betrayal. That's kind of an interesting thing about Judas. Did he know he was in the devil's grip? I wondered about that. I don't think he did. People rarely realize the spiritual dimension of evil. I don't think that Nero, who was probably one of the most corrupt leaders ever to exist, in a few years he would be Caesar from when this took place. I don't think he thought he was in the devil's grip. But if you look at what he did, he certainly was. And then just, 100 years ago, Hitler, I'm sure he didn't think he was in the devil's grip either. But if you murder 6 million people, you probably are. And I don't think he knew it. I think both Nero and Hitler were serving their egos. They had no idea. They were not aware of the spiritual dimension of things. And that's how that worked. Now for Judas, he had already arranged the betrayal of Jesus. It was just around the corner. So let's go to verse 3. Jesus knew that the Father had put him in complete charge of everything, that he came from God and was on his way back to God. So he got up from the supper table, set aside his robe, and put on an apron. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the feet of the disciples, drying them with his apron. When he got to Simon Peter, Peter said, "Master, you wash my feet?" A couple of things to note from this paragraph. One is that Jesus knew he was in charge of everything. What do people do who are in charge of everything? Well, Jesus decided to wash feet. That had to blow the minds of the disciples who were there. This was slave work. And then you wonder what Judas was thinking when Jesus washed his feet. He was probably disgusted because leaders don't do stuff like that. They don't humiliate themselves like this. That's probably what Peter was thinking too. You know, in the Gospel of John, Peter's not always portrayed in the most favorable light. There was always kind of a conflict between Peter and John, and it does kind of show sometimes. It's thought that the Gospel of Mark was dictated to Mark by Peter, and that shows Peter in a much more favorable light than the Gospel of John does. And those two Gospels were written completely independent of each other. Neither one knew the existence of the other one. So here's verse 7. Jesus answered, "You don't understand now what I'm doing, but it will be clear enough to you later." Peter persisted, "You're not going to wash my feet, ever." Jesus said, "If I don't wash you, you can't be a part of what I'm doing." That's interesting the way Jesus words this. He says, you can't be a part of what I'm doing. See, Jesus, as being the sovereign God, being in charge of everything, wanted to serve. He was setting the example. He was setting the example that Peter needed to follow. And that's what he meant with this whole paragraph. Soon Peter would become the servant. So Peter, of course, doesn't know what he's talking about here. And he goes, "Master," said Peter, "not only my feet then, wash my hands, wash my head." Jesus said, "If you've had a bath in the morning, you only need your feet washed now, and you're clean from head to toe. My concern, you understand, is holiness, not hygiene. So now you're clean." See, Jesus defined holiness as a willingness to serve. Hygiene was never his goal. He said to Peter, "Well, now if you get this, then you're clean." The model for being a follower of Jesus is to do what he did. Jesus is not concerned with how clean you are. That's the coolest thing. He doesn't care what you've done in your past. He doesn't care what you did this morning. He wants to know if you're willing to serve. And that's the important part here. He wants you to extend his presence on earth. Jesus wants you to be him on earth, to be representatives of him. Every week with the benediction, I talk about being representatives of Jesus. That's what our calling is. And to represent him, we serve. The dialogue goes on like this. Jesus is talking, and he says, "But not every one of you." He knew who was betraying him. That's why he said, "Not every one of you." After he had finished washing their feet, he took his robe, put it back on, and went back to the table. Now, I'll bet it was really quiet in that room at that point, and that all the eyes were on Jesus. Tradition has it, that this took place in the home of Mark, the editor of the second gospel. It took place in his parents' home, and that his mother was the one that served the Seder meal to these people. And then, the dialogue goes on. Then he said, "Do you understand what I've done to you? You address me as teacher and master, and rightly so. That is what I am. So if I, the master and teacher, washed your feet, you must now wash each other's feet. I've laid down a pattern for you." And he certainly did. What I've done, you do. See, serving was his point. Serve everyone, even Judas. Serve those who hurt you. Serve those who have bad attitudes. Serve those who have destructive attitudes. Serve both the grateful people and the ungrateful ones. Serve those who are nice and serve those who are mean. But serve indiscriminately. That was his whole point. He goes on and says, "I'm only pointing out the obvious. A servant is not ranked above his master. An employee doesn't give orders to the employer. If you understand what I'm telling you, act like it and live a blessed life. See, so Jesus served, and then we serve. It's very simple. Just do it, and you'll have a blessed life. A life where Jesus gives you more blessings than what you could ever imagine possible. Last couple of weeks, I've been talking about the difference between workhorses and show horses, and I want to do that again today a little bit. This is a photo I found online of a workhorse, and I can imagine that 100 years ago, most horses looked like that on various farms. My grandfather farmed with horses, and my dad would talk about it. And they were sturdy workhorses. They were called American thoroughbreds or something like that. And my dad would talk about horse-drawn wagons to pick corn. They would pick corn by hand. They had some little metal hook they put around their wrist, and they'd pull the ears off and toss them into the wagon. And the workhorses did the pulling of that wagon. The workhorses get things done. Now here's a show horse. Totally different thing. This picture is taken at the Iowa State Fair, and it's kind of an interesting place where the horse shows are. Horse shows are always packed. That arena's always full. And there's a very good reason for that. It's not the horses. It's 95 degrees and humid in Des Moines, and that is one of the few buildings that's actually air conditioned. So people will go in there and sit for hours, even if there's no show going on. They sit and watch, they watch the sand in the middle of the arena. Well, show horses stand around and look pretty, but they really don't accomplish much. I want to make the church into kind of a barn for workhorses, a place where workhorses get fed, a place where workhorses get nurtured. The workhorses are the ones that get things done. This is a show of cutting horses. And how many people know what a cutting horse is? You guys would know what a cutting horse is. It's a horse that sorts cattle. And some of them are specially trained for it, like this one in this, that guy's on there with the white hat, that you could tell that one's highly trained for it. What they do is they sort cattle. I used to do that too when I was in high school, and it was really fun, especially if you had a horse that knew what he was doing, an experienced horse, because they just turn on a dime, and you basically point out whatever steer you want to pull out of the herd, and the horse does all the work, and your job is to stay in the saddle, which is quite tricky sometimes. I had a horse that particularly enjoyed dropping me off in a cattle yard. He always found the least sanitary place to do that. But the workhorse gets his job done. Now that's not a fancy horse there. It's probably one of the cheaper horses that you could buy. But workhorses are the people who follow Jesus by serving and are not looking for praise. One of the things that occurred to me this week, I probably knew it before, but I forgot, is that if you go through the four Gospels, Jesus never once asks people to worship him. He never does. In fact, just the opposite. He tells people, don't tell anyone what's happened here until after I've risen from the dead. He did not want to be worshiped. There is someone in the Gospels that asks to be worshiped. You know who that is? That is Satan. He took Jesus to the high mountain, showed him all the kingdoms of the world, which he said he controlled, and he still does, and said, I'll give this to you if you'll bow down and worship me. Satan wants worship, and he still does. Satan wants to be worshiped. Jesus wants to wash feet. He wants to serve. He asks you to follow him. And following him is more important than worshiping him. I think you can see the difference. Satan likes to be a show horse. Jesus is the workhorse. He serves. And he asks us to serve as his representatives. The upside of that is that Jesus loves his workhorses, and he has special blessings for them. You know, the church is not a place for fashion shows. I know when I started out, I'd wear robes and suits and all that, and people would get all gussied up for Sunday morning, you know. I thought, oh, that's not what the church is for. The church is not a place for you to get your ego boosted. The church is not a place where show horses get groomed. The church is a place where the workhorses get fed. So let's make an effort to be workhorses. And as Jesus said, then live a blessed life. And we will. Let's pray together, shall we? Lord, you have indeed blessed us beyond anything we can imagine. And today we are offering ourselves to you to be your workhorses. We are asking you to guide us, show us what needs to be done, and then let us do it. We're thankful for the example that you set and for the redemption that you made possible for us with your tremendous sacrifice. So we stand ready to be your servants. Amen.
As always, thanks again for joining us. We have 2 services on Sunday morning, and if you're in town, we'd invite you to come. One's at 9 o'clock and one's at 11 o'clock. And if you wish to support Layton Bethel, you can go to laytonbethel.org and follow the steps there on our website. Or you can just look at this QR code, scan it in with your phone, and you can give through Secure Give, and all your gifts will go directly into our account. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week.